Okay, so our next speaker, Tom Andriola, is from UCLA, and I think he sees technology in a kind of a big picture sense, which might be a little bit different than some of us are thinking about, but I think he's going to have an interesting perspective for us. He is the Vice President, Information Technology Services and Chief Information Officer at UCLA. Did I get that right?
For University of California.
For the University of California, sorry, not just for UCLA. So I think we'll have some interesting perspective there. So Tom.
Okay, first order of business is watch the technology guy struggle to find his slides. Okay, I'm back here. I'm down there. Someone did a great job of putting that up. Okay, perfect. All right. So I was joking with Liz that when I got the invitation to speak, I felt like sitting with this panel of experts that I was like the busted flush. Like I'm like the card that doesn't fit into the deck, and it's because for a couple of reasons. As you said in my introduction, so my role at the University of California is I'm the Chief Information Officer, which gives me a broad range of activities that I get involved in. And it really has to do a lot about the use of technology in delivering the mission, and that crosses teaching and learning, research, healthcare, public service. And so, as he said, I have a very broad perspective on these things. And much as Russ was talking about, as we look at the challenges in education, that multidisciplinary approach and people who have different perspectives, including outsiders looking and looking at some of the underlying assumptions of those people inside, is kind of where I bring a lot of my perspective to the table. And so I'm going to talk about this from the standpoint of, a lot of talking about the higher ed side, but many of these concepts I guess will translate well into all aspects of education. By virtue of background, I came to the university about 2 years ago. I was in healthcare for many years and have watched healthcare transform itself as an industry through more informatics and connected thinking about its role and how it goes about doing what it's doing. And there are research. I was talking recently to a professor at Johns Hopkins University, Professor Dr. Ben Goldacre in the UK talks about similarities between education and healthcare, and I think there are some, and I'm going to highlight some of what, from my perspective, are the same, and what some of the differences that I've seen as I've learned more about the University of California, our mission and our role in how we're using educational technology. So for me, there's a huge amount of what they call evidence-based medicine work, and I was a part of that movement for the last 15 years. But it's interesting to pull out the words as educators and you as researchers look at this. There's some words that jump out at me from a perspective of similarities and unique ways of describing what you're trying to do. So one is really that what is that definition of professional wisdom? Right, in terms of its experience, its consensus views, and how do we inform through information, those views. And it's been talked about multiple times already this morning. How do we get that into the hands of teachers in a way that they can consume it, it's filtered to a way that they can use it and not have 50 different things that they might be looking at. Empirical evidence, it's interesting, and I'm going to talk about this in terms of some of the conversations that are going on in healthcare right now about the role of evidence-based activities, the role of research, the role of practice, and how they are both intertwining but also conflicting in one another. But I think it's this concept of that there's a lot more data being generated, and the difference between data and what is evidence is an interesting conversation in all fields, and education is no different from that. The trend, though, that we have more and more digital interactions being captured of many, many different dimensions. Whether it's, the learning assessments or the fact that now, through the visual pathways, that's data that we now capture and are storing and holding on to. In higher education, we talk about not just what goes on in the classroom, but what goes on outside the classroom. What are they doing? Are they on the meal plan? Are they eating square meals? How many hours are they spending in the library? When are they doing it? What are they checking out? How many hours are they spending, and what kind of things are they accessing from their room? All of this is data that, as you start to accumulate and think about how to use, how does it drive from data towards evidence that might inform a future activity or decision that might be made? This slide, I'm sure, is for this audience, is just kind of everything you've seen. I've pulled this from a colleague of mine, and, just talking about education to learning paradigm shift. And what strikes me as we talk about this is really the broader aspect of what's happened in our society, and as we, especially at the University of California, we're talking about that our kids, the ones that are landing on the campus in a couple of weeks, they're digital millennials. Right? I mean, they don't, at 11:30 last night, my wife caught off a conversation with one of my high schoolers. I have 3 teenagers, so, you can imagine what my life is like these days. Talking about, so how do you connect to the internet? And the lack of kind of clarity he has, other than he knows that he picks up, a device and he connects to information in the world in a way that I couldn't even imagine when I was his age. But that this world it's much more community-based, it's much more instant information at your fingertips, which is great, but it also makes it very much more complex to get the right information at the right moment at the right time. And that now is a challenge both for our teachers as well as our students, and it's something that we're trying to drive. But also the concept of personalization. Personalization started with Amazon when the internet first came out, and now we all think of we're going to get recommendations on what kind of books we might want to read, where we want to go on our next vacation. But where are we on the continuum of personalized education for the student? Where they are, at what age they are, with whatever possible difficulties or complications or disabilities that might come along with that child. Are we down the spectrum of personalization to the extent that we want to be? And how are we pushing that envelope each and every day? So this slide probably should be more evidence-based teaching and learning, and then showing for this audience just a comparison of what some of your peers that are at your institutions, when they talk about medicine, how they use their words when they talk about optimized decision-making. So basically, how do they use evidence to bring to the point where a clinician or a doctor is trying to sit down and figure out what's the next best decision for that patient? And it used to be very, very generically for, this is a patient with diabetes, to Mrs. Smith, 65 years old, Latino, what's right for her? That's where medicine has been going, and I think this is where education is trying to go, wants to go, needs to go. That it's a lifelong process. I've seen a tremendous amount of change, and it's interesting, some of the comments I've heard this morning is, thank you, don't forget, thanks you for mentioning and not forgetting about teachers. When I talk to administrators, I hear a lot about how difficult it is to get teachers to think about and be willing to change their ways in the classroom or in the lecture hall. It's an interesting, kind of, I see both ends of the spectrum get represented, is that, how do we create, for the experts, whether it be a doctor on one side or a teacher on the other side, the one who is the provider, how do we get them to open their mind to the fact that in addition to their training and their experience is now a plethora of data that they can pull on an individualized basis, more and more, to be able to figure out the right decision at this point in time around the right individual student situation. This is a huge cultural change in why, while we have a lot of great data, a lot of great evidence, a lot of great algorithms, we haven't done all that we're going to be able to do to bring it to actually provide personalized learning experiences for our student populations. One of the things that's been interesting to watch in healthcare is the doctor go from, we walk into a doctor's office and we listen to exactly what the doctor says, to the changing relationship that patients have with doctors. I haven't heard a lot, at least in the world that I live in higher education, about the changing relationship between the teacher and the student. And I'm curious, and I'm sure I'll learn a lot as I'm here this week, listening to some of you talk about how is that relationship changing, how are we thinking about it, how are we bringing it back into not only the ongoing education of the current teachers, but changing the next generation teachers that are coming into our classrooms. Different models of comparison. It's so interesting to me about, the words on this slide that I pulled from, evidence-based education are almost exact the words that we would see in the healthcare scenario. It's very, very interesting. One of the big conversations right now in healthcare that it seems to play out a little different, but has some certain attributes that seem to be the same, is in terms of what I call time to value. In a healthcare setting, that is, we have amazing research going on to help the patient, but it takes 17 years to get, that practice into the medical schools and into the medical profession. I don't know if it plays out the same way, but it seems like with an audience like this, the tremendous amount of research that goes on, the tremendous amount of algorithms that are developed that could help. What's the time to value, and what's the pathway that we're using to get it into the fact that, somewhere tomorrow in Chico, California, there is a practice that has changed with the teacher teaching instead of 6th grade students. How do we tackle that challenge? How do we think about challenge? What mechanisms do we have to change that equation going forward? It's interesting to always look at how much of the cycles talk about focus on the teachers, how much of the cycle talks about focusing on the students. The students of today, I think, are going to be much more, because they grow up with this technology, they grow up having these type of devices sitting in their hands from a very, very young age, because we take them on airplanes and we put them in their hands, we take them to restaurants and put them in their hands, and they're used to driving their own reality. And does the classroom that they walk into at age 5 and at age 12, does it reflect that same drive, or do we turn them back into, what all of us experience, which is a person up in front of the room disseminating knowledge and not as much active? I think we really have to think that. And with all the interactions that we're now driving into more digital form and collecting data around it, I'll subscribe that big data is one aspect of how do we talk about big data and mine it to create evidence to bring into practice. But I like to talk about big, diverse data, because data is not homogeneous, and we now are creating data in many, many different types, formats, venues, that some of the more interesting questions start to be, and for you as researchers, this is, I think, is what's going to drive the next decade of your research, is taking different slices of student-collected data, putting it together and saying, what interesting questions, now that we have large populations of different types of data that we've captured, what kind of questions we should be asking in research, and how do we bring that into practice? So I call that big, diverse data, because that's also a huge part of what we're doing, because so much of our world now is being digitally captured in many different forms. And I think the visual pathways is an interesting one right now. If we start capturing that data, how do we use that to figure out this is a visual learner or this is not a visual learner? And then how does that create a fork in that individual student's personalized learning program? I threw this slide up there only because I am a big believer in the personalized learning box at the end of this on the right side of that slide. I've been a huge part of the movement towards personalized medicine. It's been a privilege to come and work with the mission of teaching and learning at the University of California. We talk a lot about our students in terms of how do we make sure that they graduate. How do we help those coming as first-generation students to graduate? What are we learning about them before we come in? I think there's a need for more and more longitudinal thinking in education than what I've experienced so far here. I think there's going to be more and more longitudinal data sets created. I think there's going to be more longitudinal data sets built, that you can build it out of the plethora of data that's being collected today. But I think it all needs to drive towards this concept. At the end of the day, what we're trying, the nirvana that we like, is to create a personalized learning experience for every student, and tailored to who they are, the demographic they come from, and the background of what they bring into the start of their learning experience, and their background and capabilities. So with that, maybe just a couple of closing questions to throw out, to the group for people to think about. In healthcare, the government is taking on, the federal government is taking on a growing role in terms of making sure that we're building repositories around different types of student data, learning data, teacher data. Does that exist to the same extent in education? Are we doing that? Is the government playing that role the way that it could or should? And are we doing that in a way that also when all of you do research, does that grant say that you need to make your data available and in a format that when it's dropped into these repositories that the next researcher can use it? That's the case in healthcare today, and we're preparing our researchers for the ones that aren't doing that. They're not going to be competitive for the next round of grants. I think education, if it's not doing it today, could really, really benefit from that type of thing, because it improves the whole. Second thing is, I was on a call earlier this week. There was a mention of algorithms in the last couple of presentations. Where's the marketplace for algorithms, for all the research that you're doing? Where's the marketplace for algorithms that's thrown in there that again, you still own the content, but the algorithms are in the marketplace where other researchers could build off of them, or even the private sector could get access and license them to bring into their software applications, so we're not asking questions like Liz was. Where's that marketplace? Are we working with the for-profit sector and the venture community in a way that really, really could as an industry? I would question whether we're doing enough today. And I think I took my 3 questions and combined it somehow into 2, so I'm not sure how I did that. I think I do that a lot. So with that, there are just some thoughts from an outsider's perspective. Certainly, every time I come to this conference, I take away more than I think what I give, but I really appreciate the opportunity to share an outsider's perspective on education and how we help every student achieve their full potential. Thank you.